If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the Knoxville History Project. We've been doing these online Zooms since May of 2020, so 4 years in. We are going to have a little break over the summer. We're going to take July and August off at least and come back in the fall. Our mission is to educate, preserve, and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. If you want to watch this show, if you have to leave early, and we do record them, it usually takes us 3 or 4 days to get them online. But if you go to our Engage page, knoxvillehistoryproject.org, and we've renamed it, it used to be History Happy Hour, but it's now, if you go to the recorded programs, hopefully it's a little bit more obvious where all those recorded programs are. So what we're talking about, we're doing a preview, Jack and I, of our Symposium and special screenings that are going to be downtown starting on Thursday, the July 25th through Saturday, the 27th. To celebrate the birth of the National Park in the Smokies. I want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors. Our Mount LeConte presenting sponsors is Stowers Cat, aka Stowers Machinery Foundation. Really appreciate their support. And also our Smokies Trailblazers, Friends of the Smokies, Dana Sohn, who's the director, is with us tonight. The Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association, which I am actually a board member of as well. City of Knoxville, and also to Robert Young and Lindsay McDonough. Lindsay's with us tonight. In memory of their great grandfather, the Judge H.B. Lindsay, and we'll learn a bit more about him tonight. So thanks for all our sponsors to help underwrite the costs of all these events. We are able to do all this for free. I also want to recognize our partnering organizations, including Knox County Public Library, and as part of that is the Calvin McClung Historical Collection and TAMIS, the Tennessee Archive of Moving Images and Sound. Big thank you to East Tennessee Historical Society. They're going to be hosting us at the East Tennessee History Center for the 2 days for the symposium, as well as University of Tennessee Libraries. Smoky Mountain Radio with Bradley Reeves is going to be partnering with us on the screening of Stark Love, which we're going to mention in a minute. Already thanks Cindy Spangler. Thanks again, Cindy, for representing the Smoky Mountains Hiking Club, which is part of the story. And also for Channel 10, WBIR, who are working on 1 or 2 digital stories that hopefully will be airing ahead of the series of events in July. So thanks to all those wonderful organizations that we enjoy partnering with. So we're going to start on July the 25th. There's a kind of a little bit of fun, really. We'd originally talked about showing Kissing Cousins with Elvis Presley, but we had an offer from Bradley Reeves with Smoky Mountain Radio. Many of you may know Bradley. He created TAMIS 20 years ago, probably now, and has his own archive and also this new online radio station, Smoky Mountain Radio. And we're going to be showing a print of Stark Love, a rare film from 1927. It's going to be at Central Cinema. And it's going to include a live score by Freddie Brabson. You may know Freddie's name, or you may have seen him in person. He's the relative I knew, I guess, organist of the Tennessee Theatre. So that's going to be a great accompaniment for that. So, Jack, I'm going to hand it over to you for a few minutes to talk about this film. It was shot in the Smokies, or very near the Smokies, at least.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's confusing, I'm sure, to a lot of people, because Carl Brown, the director, was kind of rose to prominence about the same time as Clarence Brown from Knoxville, but Carl Brown was not a Knoxvillian. He was interested in this kind of vogue of naturalistic cinema, which had been tried a few times around the world in the mid-1920s. The idea was, when we think of silent film, you think of a lot of makeup and fancy costumes and so forth. And this was just the opposite of it. He took the makeup off and had people behaving as they really did in real life. In fact, would hire people who were not even actors to be in films. But a lot of the well-known, I'm trying to think of a few of the examples, but there were some about the South Pacific Islanders and some about Eskimos. But this was one that was going to be about the Southern Appalachians, and he wanted to go into the Southern Appalachians and tell a story, kind of a gritty story about a dysfunctional family who lived in the mountains. But he wanted to use actual people who lived in the mountains, people who'd never been to a place like Knoxville, to be in the film. But he came to Knoxville. He needed a couple of actors, and he came to Knoxville and found a couple. One of them was a young woman, a teenager, in fact, named Helen Mundy, who was a student at Knoxville High School at the time, and an acquaintance of James Agee, who was about the same time, I'm just same age. But she just had a natural attractiveness to her. They saw her, and this sounds like a Hollywood story, but they saw her at a Gay Street drugstore and said, she looks like the person we want for this film, and didn't apparently realize right away that she had a good deal of experience as a singer and dancer and actor in Knoxville. But they recruited her to be in this unusual film shot in the North Carolina side of the mountains, and did an interesting job of it. And this movie came out in 1927 and got a lot of attention. Here's Helen Mundy herself in the film, but this got a lot of attention in New York. It was so different from all the other movies of the time that a lot of people commented on it, and some people thought it was the best movie, one of the best movies of the year, and predicted a great career for Helen Mundy. Actually, she was a very passionate, moody young woman, and found out she really didn't like making movies. They talked to her about offered her contracts and so forth, but she actually got married to a band leader and retired at an early age. Lived up in the upper Midwest most of the rest of her life. Dropped out so thoroughly, people thought she had died. Well, this movie was missing for many, many years. Many people thought it was lost, like most of the silent films made in the 1920s are probably lost and just don't exist in any form. And it was discovered only a couple of decades ago in one copy in Eastern Europe somewhere they found and restored it, and it's now available here and there, not often shown. This is the only the second time I think there's been a big public showing of it that I remember. There was one in Tennessee Theater about probably 20 years ago that Bradley Eves and Tamas put together. But we're happy to be showing this again with Bradley's help at Central Cinema, which is a great place, a small place up in Happy Holler on North Central, to see a film. And and I'm looking forward to seeing this again. I haven't seen it since they showed it back then. But it's a fascinating, kind of unusual, very unusual film to see. But we're going to show that because it kind of shows some of the awakening fascination with the mountains in the 1920s. So much was changing in the 1920s in so many different ways in American culture. But one of those changes was this, locally certainly, was this fascination with the Great Smokies, which had been kind of forbidding and little known part of the country, and even part of our region until the 1920s. That's why we're showing it, just to have a kind of a special event to kind of give people a sort of an appetizer for the rest of the show, which is a whole lot about the 1920s, the same era the movie's being shot.
Yeah, if you've never been to Central Cinema in Happy Hollow, we hope you'll come and join us for the first time. Seats about 90 people, so it's not a big theater, but it's pretty nice in there, and get popcorn and drinks and all that. So
the beer and Mexican Coke and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and again, it's going to be free. Thanks to our sponsors that allow us to do that. And this is going to be the night before our 2-day symposium. So well, actually, I think I've even got the days wrong already. It's going to be Friday, July the 26th, and Saturday, July the 27th. So we'll make sure we get that right. So we're going to do the 2-day symposium at the History Center, and the cool thing that we're able to do, we're just about ready to go to print on this. We are printing a small little booklet that's going to have like a 3,000-word essay on the park movement from the Knoxville kind of perspective. And it's going to have like an illustrated fold-out timeline. And it's going to have little bios and highlight all the kind of key Knoxvillians that were involved in this movement. And also it's going to have little QR codes and links to the McClung collection. So if you want to go online and see some of Jim Thompson's photographs or other collections online, UT have a whole series of collections, photograph collections, the Duth Roch collection, Paul Adams collection, Thompson Brothers postcards, as well as kind of books that we recommend that you read about the national parks. So we're going to be, if you come to the symposium, well, you'll get a copy of that. So what we've done, we've put together a 2-day symposium, and each day is going to kick off with a little coffee reception. And then on each day, we're going to have a downtown conservation walking tour. So Laura Still, that we partner with Knoxville Walking Tours, that does, a lot of you may be familiar with Laura, that walks around with her audio device, giving tours practically every day. She's going to be leading the one on the Friday morning, and then Jack is going to be doing the one on Saturday. So Jack, you want to talk about a few minutes about some highlights of the tour?
Yeah, I've done this a couple times so far. Once for a national recreation organization, I did kind of a long version of it, but I've come to realize in my research that there's so much recurring important things that happen in downtown Knoxville that have to do with the theme of conservation, going back 130 years or so. And a lot of it happened downtown, and a lot of it happened in buildings that are still standing that we don't think of as being, historically important. There are places where it might be condos or offices or something today, but a lot of there are 6 or 7 buildings downtown that had people working in them on the Smoky Mountains National Park project in one way or another, and one building where some of those people lived. And that's pretty interesting that there were people who just lived in simple quarters in a place like the YMCA because they lived their main lives outside and lived in, working on the Smoky Mountains National Park. It's a fun thing, a fairly short, tight little walk around just to point out buildings I'm sure you're familiar with already, but may not know what happened there in the 1920s and 30s, and some of the very dramatic events, including a noted fistfight between some two very famous people. But we're going to be talking about, Laura and I are both kind of working with the same script, telling stories about these buildings, that some of which may deserve a plaque or two on them.
So again, yeah, we're going to be doing a conservation tour on the Friday morning at 10:15, and same again on Saturday. So Laura will do the Friday, Jack will do the Saturday. So while Laura's on the tour, doing the first tour, you'll have an opportunity, if you don't want to do the tour or are not able to come, go outside. I mean, we want to do it early because it's going to be hot in July, we expect. So I'm going to talk about a short presentation about the what we're calling the local esprit de corps. It's the Knoxville leaders and explorers of the Smoky Mountains that have been involved from the get-go all the way up to making the park a reality. So back last October, Jack and I did a pretty in-depth Zoom, which you can watch a recorded version on our website, about all the early, all the backstory, all the way back to kind of 1899 when group in Asheville put together this idea for a national park that lasted a few years and then kind of trickled away, kind of lit a fire in Knoxville to some degree, and then kind of was revisited by people like Colonel David Chapman and others at the 1913 National Conservation Exposition. Even in this process since then, we've learned a little bit more about several of these other individuals. One of our speakers, which I'll introduce in a few minutes, is talk a bit more about is recently retired professor and librarian at UT, is Ken Wise. And Ken's done so much research about the history of the Smokies. An amazing guy, written several books. And he just introduced me just a couple of weeks ago to Professor Samuel Bain. He was a UT botanist in the 1890s, fairly regularly going into the Smokies. 30, 40 years before it's a national park, even taking students, doing collecting trips. And he worked at UT's agricultural station. So he's definitely a person that we want to learn more about. And then, 15 or 20 years later, Professor Samuel Essery also took over the UT botany department, and he was doing foraging trips as well with students. And it's kind of interesting to me because there is an Essery Road in Fountain City, and I've just been able to find the connection that is actually named after him, that road in Fountain City. You probably know his work even without realizing it, perhaps if you've seen the reprinted copy of Horace Kephardt's Our Southern Highlanders, because in 1922, Samuel Essery's photograph of the chimneys was on the cover, and it's on the cover now. So it's several photographs in that reprint of Kephardt's book by Professor Samuel Essery. So he's kind of somewhat of a fairly unknown but important photographer that predated Jim Thompson. Also, Paul Fink, he wasn't from Knoxville, but in a lot of ways he was regarded as kind of an honorary Knoxvillian. He was hiking in the Smokies probably about 1914, 1915, and like several of these Knoxvillians explorers, wrote a journal and a book that Ken Wise was involved with fairly recently. Published, kind of rewritten parts of the journal by Paul Fink. It's been republished. So And so he was kind of regarded as a really authority of the Smokies because he went there so many times before World War One and afterwards, and he was very involved in the park movement, and came to Knoxville a lot, even though he was actually from Jonesboro, Tennessee. And also someone we haven't spoke about too much in the past is Robert Lindsay Mason. We've been talking to his granddaughter, Ann Winsauer, and she's been sharing some photographs of Robert Lindsay Mason and some of his work. Of course, he wrote a book in 1927, kind of really the first proper book on the Smokies, The Law of the Smokies, which was an instant hit and reprinted. It's been long out of print, so he's a name that kind of faded out of the history books, to be honest. But these kind of four individuals, some of those guys, larger guys that were going into the Smokies at a time when most people in Knoxville probably either couldn't see the Smokies because of the smog, or it was just, as Jack said earlier, was a forbidding place. So this kind of eases into learning more about who these were involved from Knoxville. I just want to highlight a few others that we're going to get into in the symposium. Some you'll know the names. Colonel David Chapman. Chapman Highway is named after, and Mount Chapman in the national park. He's regarded as the father of the national park for all the work that he did with the Conservation Association, taking the lead in acquiring 6,600 different property parcels to create Smoky Mountains National Park. We'll learn a bit more about him in a bit. Of course, Jim Thompson, famous name in Knoxville, fantastic photographer who hiked so much in the Smokies, mainly with his heavy camera equipment, but also he did a lot of work on the Smoky Mountain Nomenclature Committee, and also forging the path and marking the Appalachian Trail. And we'll pick up that story in a little bit. I'd never seen this photograph, actually, until I went in to Haler Outdoor Center in Gatlinburg about 10 years ago and tracked it down at Thompson Photo. It's rare that you get a photograph with so many explorers in it. And there's another great one coming up, particularly with the leaders. But we also have, again, someone who's not terribly known, Harry Jennison. Again, he was a professor of botany at UT. He worked for the Park Service in its very nascent days in the Smokies. And, he published and wrote and published a small booklet called The Flora of the Great Smokies in 1939, just before his death at a fairly young age. And also Brockway Crouch. He didn't write books, but he was a staunch supporter of the Smokies movement. He was a co-founder of the East Tennessee Ornithological Society. He owned a florist business that is kind of family business, and it was right on. If you're familiar with where the rowboat statue is on Gay Street at Church, that's where one of his florist shops was in the 1920s, and a lot of people congregated right there. It's a meeting place that came and talked about the Smokies and met and got into cars, because there was people like Dutch Roth and Carlos Campbell. They didn't even drive. They relied on other people to get to the Smokies, and they went a lot. So this is a wonderful photograph that just highlights some of these people that we'll be talking about. They'll be highlighted in this booklet, but also in my talk about Esprit de Corps. Right now, Jack and I are just going to talk about a few pivotal moments of the park movement that is a big part of this story. And again, we've done a lot of research into the backstory, but, kind of went quiet probably during the First World War years about the idea of having a national park in the Smokies or in eastern United States. But it was in 1923 when Annie Davis and her husband Willis Davis, they were on their way back from going to Yosemite National Park and probably Yellowstone as well. They'd been out there on a vacation and they were on the way back on the train. And, these were pretty prominent Knoxvillians. Willis was the head of the Knoxville Iron Works, very, very involved with the Knoxville Automobile Club. Both of them very well connected. And she said to her husband, and we've got a quote right here. Well, I'll bring up Yosemite National Park. Let me say this before we get into the quote. Yosemite was created as a national park along with Sequoia National Park in 1890, and the first national park was Yellowstone. So, these were the big iconic parks, which they are still now, of course, that were very inspirational to people in Knoxville. I've got a photograph of inside of Harry and Alice's Imes's house, and in the back you can see a picture of the United States with the national parks marked on it. And, just a bit amazing. It was obviously a big deal to be able to travel across United States, before regular air travel, and then come back and be inspired to make these mountains that you could see from Knoxville, possibly a new national park. So this is what she said famously, that we have seen some beautiful country and grand mountains, but nothing more beautiful and majestic than our own Great Smokies. Why then there should be national parks in the West and only one small national park in the eastern half of the US? Why shouldn't our Great Smokies be a national park? So what she was referring to, that one small national park, was Acadia National Park in Maine that had been created just 4 years before in 1919, the only national park on the eastern seaboard. So she fired up her husband, and they came back into Knoxville, and he said, like, I guess what most husbands rationally should say is, well, that's a great idea. I'll see what I can do about it. Jack, you want to pick up the story and talk a little bit more about the Davises?
Sure. Yeah, they're not originally from Knoxville. They came here from Louisville, Kentucky, but he took a job as the chief of the Knoxville Iron Company, which was a major one of our major industries here, and believe it or not, it kind of still exists as a internationally owned steel mill in Lonsdale. That's the direct descendant of what Willis Davis came here to work on. But he was, by the early 1920s, he'd been here for several years and was well connected. But Annie Davis was a very cosmopolitan, elegant lady wearing a pearl necklace in this picture. But she was a Bryn Mawr grad, but was a woman who was involved in lots of things. She was involved in the voting rights movement, was involved in the League of Women Voters in the 1920s, and was soon to be one of the first women from Knoxville to be elected to public office. And in 1925, she became our state legislator in Nashville, and used that role for her two-year term to further this Great Smoky Mountains National Park idea, which she had first proposed only a couple of years earlier, but did a lot of work in terms of getting the state to purchase some lumber, the Little River lumber area and that sort of thing. But that they were a kind of a dynamic duo in some ways in the 1920s, making these things work. Willis Davis died before the Smokies was completely completed as a park, but I think he saw it that it was about to happen. They lived actually first in the apartments in Fort Sanders along 17th Street that are still there today, but later on lived on Lions View. But after her husband died, she moved. She loved the Smokies so much she moved to the Gatlinburg area and spent the rest of her life up there. But a very interesting pair, and who knows if the Smokies would even exist today if not for them.
So, if you know anything about the history of the Smokies, I mean, it's a classic story, but, within several months, barely just a few months, Willis had engaged the leaders of the Knoxville Automobile Club, and you can see several of them here. And they came up with this great idea, is to turn this idea into a sustainable grassroots organization. So they met in Judge H.B. Lindsay's, Barton Lindsay's office on Gay Street in the Burwell, the building right opposite where the symposium will be at the History Center, and that's going to be a stop, of course, on the downtown tours. But the other leaders of the Automobile Club, Karen Rogers, who was a pioneering automobile inventor, Judge Daniel Clary is related to Bob Webb, who started Webb School, and of course Colonel Chapman was kind of a bit of a small player, I guess, in some degree in terms of the Automobile Association at that time. But they were all advocating for good roads and having roads that would, connect Knoxville over the mountains into North Carolina, for 15, 20 years. Several of them were, attorneys that were representing companies that had owned vast tracts in the mountains. But on, December the 23rd in 1923, they did establish the Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association, and it was largely pretty much the same players. And they kind of joked sometimes they didn't know, when one meeting had turned into another organization's meeting. But ultimately, it was sustainable. Some of these players, these leaders, kind of took a step back, probably to work more on the Knoxville Automobile Association. And Colonel David Chapman, along with Willis Davis, continued. Kind of stepped into the leadership role. Well, obviously, Willis Davis, as we just showed him, but Colonel David Chapman's probably a little bit of a silent partner for the first few meetings, but he really became the de facto leader. Any comments, John?
Oh yeah, just all these people have fascinating stories of their own. Judge Lindsay was much respected jurist in Knoxville. Was actually a nominee for governor. I don't think he was that interested in getting into politics, but people wanted him to be governor. Some other people wanted him to be senator, and he kind of politely declined those honors about the same time as these meetings were about to start. Cowan Rogers was the guy that created the first automobile ever seen in Knoxville back in 1898, when he was best known as a tennis champ and a bicyclist. He got a bike shop down in the Bowery area, kind of a scary part of town to some people, some middle class Knoxvillians of his who are his neighbors over on Cumberland Avenue. But he worked on it and worked on it and built a couple of cars and realized that he was never going to catch up with Mr. Ford up north. So he started selling cars. And if a lot of you remember Rogers Cadillac, that's the last articulation of the car company that he founded downtown many years earlier. It claimed to be the oldest car dealership in the South when it closed. Judge Webb was our friend Bob Webb's father, and was a well-known lawyer in town for many years. Was in the firm of Green and Webb, also in the Burwell building. So he didn't even have to leave the building to go up to Judge Lindsay's office to attend this meeting. But he, by the way, he was also an early suburbanite, lived in the Westmoreland area. And if you know the water wheel on Westland Drive, that was Judge Webb's creation, built that water wheel to pump water up to his house. But then, of course, Colonel Chapman was kind of, as Paul says, kind of a minor player in 1923, 24, but very quickly rose into a leadership position. He was a pharmaceutical executive downtown, well-known figure in Chapman Drugs, but also a military man. Was a colonel in the Army, was training troops and so forth during World War I. So this is kind of an interesting, I don't know if you'd call it a dream team for the people who would get this together or not, and several other people. Some of them ended up kind of becoming sort of rebels from the group, like James Wright, who decided he did not like the park idea, and after all, and he was in favor of having a harvestable forest in the Smokies. But the rest of them kind of stuck together and over many years made it work. And this is just the original core, but many other people joined in the months and years after December of 1923, which is when really this all started. Paul?
Yeah, so by spring of 1924, just a couple, 2 or 3 months afterwards, the federal government had put together the Southern Appalachian National Park Commission. It was this kind of national movement just occurring that it was inspiring other states to kind of advocate for places in their own states that had potential to be a national park. So the newly formed Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association, they realized that they needed to learn more about the Smokies. So they put together this 5-6 day expedition in, I think it was in May of 1924, just learn as much as they could about the flora and fauna and how the Smokies topography was. They also went over to Bryson City. They wanted to make connections and learning about what North Carolinians felt about it. Of course, even 25 years before, in 1899, that the big movement before was started there in Nashville. They did meet with Horace Kephart and kind of, made friends and made connections, and also kind of came back with the language that they'd be able to sell this idea to other leaders in Knoxville and politicians across the state. And by July, the Southern Appalachian National Park Commission, they were already, looking at some sites, and they were very hot on the Linville Gorge, Grandfather Mountain area in North Carolina. And Knoxville felt that, that their idea, that their hope for even being considered was kind of slipping away even before it was even started. And Colonel Chapman had this idea to send they had already nominated Jim Thompson to be the official photographer for the Conservation Association. He'd been taking photographs of wildflowers in the mountains for his mother in 1915 and was, very familiar with how to get there and take great photographs, and already had a cache of wonderful photographs. He took several albums and photographs in his car over to this meeting at the Grove Park Inn in Asheville, where the commissioners were meeting. And the commissioners agreed to have a meeting with the Knoxville contingent, even though they weren't planning at all and going to even checking the Smokies out physically. They were so amazed by Thompson's photographs that they did agree to come to Knoxville. And here, at least two of the commissioners, if not three, are here in front of the Farragut Hotel on Gay Street. Colonel David Chapman is here if we zoom in, and they are being filmed by these Keystone filmmakers who had agreed to come in. I can't remember the backstory at this minute, but they've been invited in or volunteered to come in and film and document this expedition, which turned out to be about 6 days. Chapman and the other leaders of the association hired trail guides, people like Wiley Oakley from Gatlinburg, but also locals like Paul Adams, which we're going to meet in a minute. And the commissioners, they went up to Cherokee Orchard and hiked up past Rainbow Falls. The trails there were barely trails. They weren't like they are today. And they spent the night in the rain on Mount LeConte, and then had to come down and blaze trails. The trail guides like Adams had to blaze trails ahead of the party. One of the commissioners, and also Willis Davis, fell and was injured a little bit coming down, but everyone had such an amazing time that the commissioners were really blown away by the Smokies. And, to cut a very long story short for tonight, by December, the Smokies are going to be recommended as a site of the national park. And we want to get into all the detail of the symposium about how that actually works. It really is a fiendishly complex story, but within 6 months or just less than a year, Great Smoky Mountains and Shenandoah Valley in Virginia were recommended to be sites to become a national park, which meant that Tennessee and North Carolina had to acquire, well, originally the first goal was actually the 300,000 acres to be considered to be a national park. Colonel Chapman was successfully able to advocate to downgrade that to 150,000. And this is one of the kind of pivotal stories of the movement, is that these goals kept kind of changing. But as Jack said, Annie Davis campaigned to become a state representative, a legislator, and introduce a bill to acquire the first major tract, 78,000 acres, owned by the Little River Lumber Company, which was owned by Colonel Townsend. It was turned down on the first reading, but Annie Davis and other local leaders involved, the Conservation Association and also the Knoxville Chamber, put together this turned out to be a wonderful train excursion to Altamont in the Smokies, and all the local leaders and politicians from Knoxville and Nashville really saw the value in it. So this is kind of a part of the story that we want to tell about Knoxville's involvement, because the state asked Knoxville to contribute a third of that purchase price, which was then in 1925, 91,000, probably several $million today, to contribute to that first purchase. So that's kind of a pivotal date in the timeline. And there's Annie Davis herself standing back there, third from the left, and Governor Austin Peay signing the bill in 1890. You want to add, Jack, before we move on?
Yeah. Just I've never seen as influential as she was in the Smokies, I've never seen a picture of her that looked very outdoorsy. She's always in pearls and wearing a mink in this one, but that's of course what an influential woman of 1925 was likely to wear. But Austin Peay is signing with that long quill pen, and Austin Peay didn't live much longer than this. And after he was a major supporter of public education at the college level. And the Austin Peay building at UT, which already existed, was something else, but they renamed it Austin Peay for him because he'd been a big friend to UT. It was from Middle Tennessee, but was of course Austin Peay University is named for him as well. But this is one of the big moments of his career as governor of Tennessee, was signing this bill.
So the next three years really, involved a lot of fundraising in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Knoxville did raise quite a lot of money, led by Colonel Chapman and the other leaders. Again, cut a long story short for tonight, Chapman was very, very involved with his connections with the National Park Service and in Washington, D.C., and was really credited with being really instrumental in approaching John D. Rockefeller Jr. and asking for $5 million, which was a matching gift. By then it's estimated that we'd have to raise a total of $10 million. And then we're getting close to raising close to $5 million, and John D. Rockefeller wouldn't match it. He didn't actually just give them $5 million. I mean, they had to acquire acreage and then get reimbursed. And this is kind of one of two photographs. There's a much larger grouping in the newspapers on Gay Street. They're outside the City National Bank, I think, Jack, on Gay Street, about where the S&W cafeteria is today on Gay Street. That building still exists in a different front to it. But these are some of the interesting people that are actually in this photograph. On the far left, we have Ben Morton, the mayor of Knoxville at the time. If you drive up to Newfound Gap in the park today, you can stop at the Ben Morton Overlook. We have Willis Davis himself, just a year after, 5 years after he supported his wife's idea, and 3 or 4 years really just before he passed away. Curl Chapman in the middle that we've already talked about. Austin Peay's successor, Tennessee Governor Henry Horton. Right at the end, W.S. Shields
Watkins Field. Yeah.
Watkins Field is named after him, isn't it, Jack?
Yeah.
His name that doesn't really come up much in the Smoky story, but he's a name that we come across in Knoxville history. Kerry Spence, who was another quite well-known Knoxvillian and civic booster at the time, and also Karen Rogers in the second row that we just met. J. Wiley Brownlee is somebody that we don't often see photographed as one of the original directors of the Great Smoky Mountain Conservation Association. And then there's also Frank Maloney, South Knoxville resident, and very, very involved with the Conservation Association, and much later was really instrumental in Foothills Parkway being established just outside the park. And also here we have Arno Camara, assistant director of the National Park Service, obviously was somebody that David Chapman had to make his acquaintance and developed a good friendship with him in Washington, D.C. Anything you want to add, Jack?
Just Mount Camera is named for that. How many people with mountains named for them are in that picture? I mean, there are a few of them, mountains and other features in the Smokies. Of course, Mount Chapman and Ben Morton Overlook. There's a lot of honor to these characters who did play an important role at that time. And that day, interestingly, maybe overstating it just a bit, but the newspapers were just, this was huge. All these important people, a couple of governors, I think the governor of North Carolina was here too, and people from Washington, from the Coolidge administration were here. And there were some people were claiming in the News Sentinel or and Journal that this was the most important day in Knoxville history, was this a gathering of financiers, basically, who were going to make the Smoky Mountains National Park idea work.
So we often say that in 1930, the Smokies was kind of unofficially open, but if you dive in and kind of read more of the detail about what was going on, and there was just a lot of things going on in the background, trying to acquire property, parcels, also, talking to, the whole story, the whole backstory of talking to, the mountain people and their removal and all that David Chapman got a bad name, particularly for as kind of the leader of all this. But in 1930, there was a big kind of donut hole in what was then, considered almost official of the Great Smoky National Park, and that was the Champion Fiber Company. They own, I can't remember how many thousand acres they owned, but Mount LeConte was part of that. So even in 1930, when we read in the history books and considered that Smokies was all, was kind of unofficially open, Mount LeConte, which even though you could hike it, was still not officially part of the national park at that point. And then in 1934, we now recognize as the official kind of birthday of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and celebrated by one of Jim Thompson's photographs turned into a postage stamp. Wonderful recognition for him. It's still amazing to go back and look at those dates and figure out exactly why it was decided of June the 15th, because I talked about earlier about in 1925, 1926, when the park movement had to acquire 300,000 acres and then having that goal reduced to 150,000. to be able to, not necessarily establish the park, but set aside this area to become a park. It wasn't until later in the 1920s when the federal government, almost seemingly for the Knoxville leaders, of course, kind of, changed that goal. So it became 427,000 acres that needed to be acquired for the government to be able to accept it and able to, establish it and develop it. So even in 1934, I don't remember exactly when Sugarlands was, visitor center was established, but the infrastructure that we know today wasn't in 1934. That came, later, and that's why it wasn't until 1940 that President Roosevelt came here, and we had, what became the famous dedication on September the 2nd, 1940. We've just been kind of talking loosely between Jack and Jim Matheny, who is a great ally with the Friends of the Smokies, and just put a wonderful little video out, actually, about these different dates and how you can celebrate the 90th or the 100th anniversary on different dates. It's quite fascinating to see how all these little dates, what they mean and what could mean. And that Roosevelt was in the region. It came to Knoxville, in 1936, Jack. So there was very specific reasons why the dedication was delayed. We're going to get into some of those details in the symposium.
Yeah, I think we should expect to see about 16 years worth of centennials about the birth of the Smoky Mountains National Park over the next, but we're glad to be here at the very beginning of it. But you'll hear more, I'm sure, from the park and from other places in years to come.
So that's just a little history, some key moments and in the Smokies Park movement. We're going to shift gears a little bit and just talk about some of the programs that we're going to be doing at the symposium. And on the Friday kind of keynote speech, address is going to be by Jack, the Queen City of the Mountains. Back over to you, Jack.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of a sense of what I'm going to be talking about, how Knoxville in the 1890s was mainly an industrial city. You occasionally heard the mountains mentioned, but they were kind of distant and forbidding. They were mainly a source of lumber for a lot of the businesses in Knoxville, like the Atkin Mantle Company and various architects. Of course, George Barber was building wooden houses, Victorian houses, using a lot of this lumber. So the lumber was a big part of Knoxville's industry, but we didn't go to the Smokies much. We saw them from a distance when the factory smoke allowed us to see through the air in those days. But there was more and more interest in the Smokies, and of course people didn't come close to the mountains very much in those days because the railroads stayed in the valleys, and of course the rivers were in the valleys, and people coming and going to Knoxville would never even get very close to the Smoky Mountains. They would just see them at a distance to the south. But this started to change in the very early 20th century with of course, a few people got to know the mountains through Elkmont, and that was by 1909, 1910. People were riding Colonel Townsend's railroad up to Elkmont, and a few of them had cabins up there. And some of the people who had cabins up there were, including the Davises and David Chapman, were instrumental in making the idea for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park work in years to come. About the same time, we began having these expositions, Appalachian expositions of 1910, 1911 in Chilhowie Park that drew a large number of people from outside the region to come witness this kind of examination of our region in a way. But then the first ever conservation exposition in world history was in 1913 at Chilhowie Park, and drew more than 1 million people. And some people who were later involved in the Smoky Mountains National Park movement, including David Chapman, were there in administration at the Conservation Exposition of 1913. I'd like to make some ties to that huge event. The biggest event in Knoxville before the World's Fair of 1982 was the Conservation Exposition of 1913. And I think it had, if not a causal effect, certainly a significant influence on the Smokies movement in years to come. But there became to be a split between the conservationists. Conservationists could be okay with harvesting the mountains, and some wanted to make it a national forest and wanted to keep harvesting it for Knoxville industries, and they wanted that. But other people began to understand by the 1920s that having something beautiful and visitable so close to Knoxville could be a great asset to the city, and that's how the both as a place to visit and to live for the hotel people and for people who say come move to Knoxville. It's got the Smoky Mountains. That this was something that was of great interest to people of like the Chamber of Commerce, like Carlos Campbell, the chief of the Chamber of Commerce, who became a major figure in the Smokies movement. But of course, and that happened. The Andrew Johnson Hotel was built partly with the promise of Smokies tourism. Chapman Highway suddenly became a thing. Chapman Highway didn't exist until it was a place that went to the Smokies, and it suddenly popped up, bloomed with hotels and restaurants and souvenir shops. That tourism was a big part of the history of South Knoxville, as we're learning, getting into the research into South Knoxville for our upcoming book. But even things like baseball, Knoxville baseball, it had lots of names over the years. There were Reds, and then there were the Appalachians, and then there were the Pioneers. But in 1925, they picked the name Smokies because this effort was starting, and the Knoxville Smokies was representing this Smoky Mountains National Park effort, which and it's still we're going to have the Smokies return next year, interestingly, so to Knoxville. But this was a very exciting time for a lot of folks, and a whole generation of progressive-minded people were all about the Smoky Mountains National Park happening here, and it needed this much energy because it was an extremely difficult thing to put together with more than 6,000 different parcels of property in the Smokies that had to be acquired. Some of them were residences, some of them were big industrial tracts, but these were all put together and to make a single national park that the whole nation could enjoy. It's just remarkable. It happened over a period of about 20 years, with a lot of it led by Knoxville business interests, and a lot of people had different ideas about this, but they somehow came together. Sometimes came to blows, but they somehow cooperated enough to make it work.
I just want to finish just talking about some of our other speakers that are going to be at the symposium. We've got Ken Wise is going to be talking about a remarkable duo on Mount LeConte, a remarkable Knoxville duo, really. Even though Paul Adams wasn't born here, born in Illinois, spent some time growing up in North Carolina, but really started writing journals, nature journals, when he was 6. And he was a little kind of fickle child, but he really turned into a strapping lad by his experiences outdoors. And after he came to Knoxville, started exploring the Smokies in 1918 when he was still a teenager, frankly. But he was very involved with the East Tennessee Ornithological Society at the Imes place. Knew Mr. Iams, and he ended up turning his journals into a kind of a self-published book in the 60s, and as we'll see in a second, two are now been published by UT Press. So Ken's going to tell the story, and it's probably one of the most endearing stories of the Smokies movement, when Paul Adams was selected by Colonel Chapman to go up to Mount LeConte and manage the first official campsite. And he chose a South Knoxville dog, so named Cumberland Jack, that he renamed Smoky Jack, and fashioned these cavalry officers' saddlebags to sit on the dog's back. And he turned trained the dog to be able to go down from the peak of Mount LeConte into Gatlinburg and bring up back on the trail up to 30 pounds of his weight, a third of his body weight, packed into his leather saddlebag. So Ken is going to tell Paul Adams' story. Ken is a great fellow and a great writer, and these are just 3 of the books that he's been involved with. Smoky Jack was written, of course, by Paul Adams based on his journals, but it was never published until UT Press published it, which has a really great annotated introduction and photographs with the help of Ann Bridges and Ken Wise, who at that time were the heads of the Great Smoky Mountains project at the University of Tennessee Libraries. And also the same year, both of them edited a great version of Mount LeConte, which is kind of expanded version of Paul Adams's memoir that was published on his own in 1966. And also Ken, along with Anne and Russell Clement, also was involved with this wonderful book, the Terra Incognita Reader, featuring early writings of the Great Smoky Mountains. Several Knoxvillians, Ebenezer, what's the fellow's name? Jack, was a professor at UT. Not to worry, we can come back to him another time. But these are wonderful books by Ken, and Ken's also done hiking trails in Smokies as well. So we look forward to Ken being with us. This is another photograph taken in 1927 when Paul Adams was a trail guide the year after that he had stopped managing that camp, which very quickly turned into the lodge that we know today. And here are some of the other Knoxvillians like Dutch Roth and Brockway Crouch and Jim Thompson there on the far right that we'll learn more about in the symposium as well. And then from across state lines, we've got Professor Daniel Pierce from Western North Carolina University. He's going to be talking about how the Knoxville contingent, who were they working with, or maybe who they were loggerheads with across state lines. Of course, you can go up to Newfound Gap today and kind of stand on the state line in one foot in North Carolina, as the Smokies let you do that. So that's what Daniel Pierce is going to be talking about, and also the logging companies that were trying to log the Smokies even while we were trying to protect it as a national park. We talked about Horace Kephart earlier on. He was a very important figure in North Carolina. People like Jim Thompson and Dutch Roth on the nomenclature committee, also with Paul Fink, who was the head of it actually in Brockway Crouch. They were working with these guys, including the wonderful photographer George Marsa, who was from Japan. You probably have heard of him perhaps. So that's what Daniel Pierce is going to be talking about, and Dan's done is great authority on the Smokies. Wonderful book, which is a little bit different from Carlos Campbell's Birth of the National Park, The Great Smokies from National Habitat to National Park. And I just picked up a copy of the illustrated guide of the Smokies. If you've never seen that, it's a really neat look at some old kind of vintage and retro post of the Smokies and kind of framing the Smokies in terms of its icons, like Rainbow Falls and Clingman's Dome and everywhere that you all know. So we're looking forward to welcoming these speakers into Symposium. Janine Winfrey, one of the archivists at TAMIS, the Tennessee Archive of Moving Image and Sound, is going to be talking to us about Laura Thornburg. It's a wonderful, she started out as a film editor actually, and Laura and Janine has done separate programs on Laura's efforts across career as a film editor for the federal government. And then she was a journalist with the Knoxville News Sentinel in Knoxville, and then later became a very talented photographer as well. This is you may have seen this photograph before of Molly McCarter, one of the Smoky Mountain residents that she taught a child in 1937. And also published really after Robert Lindsay Mason's kind of the next kind of famous book on the Great Smoky Mountains, published in 1937. This is the cover actually illustrated by Harry Irons from 1938. So that's one of the other programs that we're going to be doing on the Saturday morning. And then kind of keynote speech on the talk on the Saturday at noon is with David Brill. David has written many articles in Smokies Life, hiked Smokies extensively. But in 1979, as a fairly young man, I think he was 23, he decided to hike the entire length of the Appalachian Trail from Springer Mountain in Georgia all the way up to Mount Katahdin in Maine. And if you've not read his book, I'll show you now. As far as the eye can see, it's been in print on 4th edition now. A wonderful book. I would really recommend you reading that. But backwards onto, it's also going to be talking about the development of the Appalachian Trail and the Knoxvillians that were involved with it, like Harvey Broom. So I'm going to hand it over to Jack. Jack loves talking about Benton McKay and his links to Knoxville and TBA.
Yeah. Benton MacKaye, a lot of people know his name. He, the father of the Appalachian Trail, but a lot of people don't know that he lived in Knoxville for several years. And he was a middle-aged man when he, like a lot of idealistic, leading, cutting-edge conservationists, foresters, and other people, got jobs with TVA in Knoxville in the 1930s, in the idealistic days of TVA. And he moved to Knoxville, and interestingly, got connected with some other interesting conservationists here, including Harvey Broom. But like it's kind of fascinating to look at the fact that a lot of these people who were interested in the mountains didn't buy houses with yards here. Their yard was the Smokies, so they would just live in an apartment or live in the YMCA, as Benton MacKaye did when he first got here. He later had a small place in Maplehurst, I think, but he had his office at TVA, and his he was kind of one of the older people involved in the conservationist movement, but had an office in the Arnstein building downtown, and it became kind of a gathering place for these idealists who got together. And he and Harvey Broom and several others, some of them who had TVA connections, uh, founded a national organization called the Wilderness Society, which in 1935, which was beyond the Smokies. This is the idea of saving wilderness, not for us to use and enjoy, but just because it's wilderness, just to save it in as natural a state as we can because it's important. And that was kind of his point of view on that. But it's that's a whole like a second wave of conservationism that happened here. And a lot of it happened here in Knoxville too, and he deserves to be part of the story. I look forward to hearing. I've known David a long time, and look forward to hearing his talk.
Yeah, so David, again, authored this great book, and he's going to be talking about kind of the development of the Appalachian Trail. Um, and hopefully, we're also going to highlight some of the people that were hiking it in the late 19, in the 1930s, like Jim Thompson. He was a big part of that effort to put the Appalachian Trail through the Smokies, as was Dutch Roth. And, you may have read some of the tales of hikers like Dutch Roth and Carlos Campbell that were actually hiking it, probably the first time in kind of the mid 1930s. I think this photograph is when they'd hiked from Newfound Gap to Deals Gap, I think, doing half of it in several days. And I think they did the whole thing on one of the trips as well. And they were so stinky after the end of the trip that everyone kind of got off the bus when they were getting back into Knoxville. We'll get into some of those stories too. And then, we're going to wrap up the symposium with a look at artists that were inspired by the Smokies before the park movement, as well as during it. So Jack's going to be leading a panel discussion with Steve Cottam, who's the retired manager of the McClung Collection, and Stephen Wicks, who's the curator of the Knoxville Museum of Art. We're just going to highlight two or three things here tonight. Kick off talking about Belle Isle from Line's View, this wonderful painting that's part of the collection at KMA. One of the best places in Knoxville you can actually see the Smokies. If you go up to Lakeshore Park today, you can almost see this exact view.
Yeah, and this is very, very close to the view that Willis and Annie Davis had in their home on Line's View in the late 1920s. But artists have played such an important role in a lot of things. Of course, the role of Jim Thompson is very clear cut. He's an artist with a camera, as was George Massa. But I'm reminded of the fact that Jane Jacobs, the great kind of new urbanist theorist about how cities work, she said the dangerous neighborhoods of cities go through different spells, and the first people who are bold enough to live in the dangerous neighborhoods are the artists, and that's true in almost every city. It was true in the old city 40 years ago. It was true all over the place. But it just occurred to me that kind of the same thing is true with the mountains. The first people who went to the mountains, who took the trouble to go there, and it was not easy to get to the mountains. 120 years ago, you usually had to make it a multi-night trip. You had to take a tent just to go, and because there weren't good roads. But it was, and you had to trespass some, you had to take some risks. These were all artists who were just committed to it. And the first of them was a guy named, the first one I know of, was an interesting guy that connects the whole German immigration era with the 20th century conservation era. The refugees who came here after the revolutions of 1848 included the Crouch family who came here. And Charles Crouch was born into this family and grew up in Knoxville, fascinated with the Smoky Mountains. He never married, was just completely fascinated with the Smokies. He was a musician, played organ in some churches, but mainly his passion was the Smoky Mountains. And he would vanish for weeks at a time. His family would wonder where he was. He'd come back with a bunch of rolled up canvases. These people were in Knoxville were fascinated with these scenes of the Smokies, these mountains that they had actually never seen. Because in 1900 it was easier to get to Cades it was easier to get from Knoxville to Times Square in New York than to get to Cades Cove. Literally, all you had to do was get on a train and to see New York. But it took a lot of doing. You had to know people. You had to change mules a couple of times. You had to try different things to get into the mountains where you could really see them. And Charles Crouch was one of the first people who was really willing to do that and bring back these canvases to show people what they looked like. Next one. But there are actually several artists. This is, of course, Harry Imes is a well-known artist, mainly a commercial artist in his time, but his passion was the outdoors. And it's interesting that when he drew the Smokies, always drew Knoxville as part of the picture. But he was this is the same Harry Imes who founded the wonderful sanctuary that became the Imes Nature Center after his death. But was an important early figure. But we're talking about, I told us on some about Robert Lindsay Mason, who's a fascinating figure. We think of artists, and I know of a lot of visual artists who admit that they just hate dealing with words. They're not good with words. Robert Lindsay Mason was a rare feature. There was a great artist, but also a great writer, and wrote about the Smokies. And The Lure of the Great Smokies is mainly a great work of prose. But at the same time, he had an art studio downtown and taught a lot of people who made a career in art. I'll be talking about some of his students as well. Charles Griffin Farr, and who was a very interesting artist who also hiked in the Smokies in the 20s, but had developed a style very different from anyone else's. Mary Granger, who was a teacher at Knoxville High School, was very influential on many other artists, but ended up kind of devoting a lot of her own work to the Smokies. But there's a moment in 1927 when they had what they call the spring exhibition in a gallery at the Daylight Building. The same Daylight Building is a brand new building back then that has the Union Avenue bookstore in it. That was kind of an eye-opening to a lot of people especially who'd never seen the Smokies. But Charles Crouch had worked there, Hugh Tyler had worked there, Mary Granger, all these people had work about the Smoky Mountains. And of course, this was a time that it was still just being developed as a national park. And I want to just talk about how exciting this was to this whole generation of artists. By the way, we're going to be talking about that and at our next Maple Hall event on July 9th, the second Tuesday of July. And I'm going to be talking about the 1920s and how many things just changed and completely flipped in Knoxville. The Jazz Age was the Jazz Age here, but it was also the Conservation Age, and all these things. Some of these things were kind of connected in lots of interesting ways that we'll be talking about then. But anyway, there's a great deal to talk about and a lot of such interesting characters. And I thank and congratulate Paul for bringing us this far with it and for taking the lead in this because it's something, a story that I think needed to be told. I probably wouldn't have had the energy to tell it myself, but very proud to help Paul with this job. And thanks also to Nicole, our good administrative coordinator, Nicole Stahl, who makes these things possible every little bit. But we're going to take like Paul said, you want to add anything, Paul, to the presentation?
Just the fact that we're going to be posting the symposium schedule online in the next few days, and then and you'll get all the information through the KHP newsletter next week, and then I think we're going to go live with the registration on July 1. It's all going to be free. We just want to know exactly how many people we can accommodate. And also give you the opportunity to order a lunch on the Friday and Saturday. But the other thing we're going to do as well is that on the Friday night, we haven't quite figured this out yet exactly, but we're going to be partnering with Eric Dawson at the McClung Historical Collection and John Morton with Tamis on the Friday night. So spend all day Friday with us and then stay for the evening at the Bijou Theatre. We're going to be putting together a special evening looking at some of this artwork, the photographs of Jim Thompson, kind of telling a story from a different perspective visually. And if you want to see some of these really old, wonderful Jim Thompson photographs and some of these paintings, and some moving footage on the big screen in a beautiful historic theatre, and I really hope that you will come out for that. So that's just going to be another way to experience this art movement history on the Friday night. So there's plenty of opportunity to come and spend some time with us that week. Appreciate you joining us, and hopefully many of you will come and participate and celebrate the Knoxville history and the history of the Smokies all together. Yeah. The end of July.
Hope to see you all then. Any questions or comments? Okay, we appreciate it, folks, and we hope to see you next month.